Welcome to another edition of Hanrick Curran Insights. Today we're addressing an information gap for many clients with ageing parents. We've invited a specialist in aged care, David Peck, to demystify planning for aged care. We hope you find the session informative.
The key messages of this whole presentation are that aged care system is very complex. You don't need to be an expert, but to have a good understanding of the issues is a really good idea. You should really seek professional advice before you're forced into making decisions that you might regret. And the last thing is that you can make far better lifestyle and financial decisions if you plan well ahead. To help illustrate the complexities of aged care planning and aged care fees, I want to introduce a family to you. Let's call them the Wilsons. We have Brian, who's 81, and his wife Helen, who is 76. Now they're full-age pensioners, and their situation is not very complex at all. They live in a home, they have personal assets of only $10,000 being their contents, and they have a term deposit which they earn income from. Their outgoings are, again, pretty much matching what their income is, and they have a son who is Tim, and he holds power of attorney. Brian's health has been deteriorating, and Tim is starting to get concerned about that, and he wants to start to plan or think about what the next step should be. Thankfully, Helen is fine and she is well. Now, Tim is concerned about a number of things. Firstly, he's thinking cash flow. How are mum and dad going to be able to pay for aged care if dad needs to go in when really right now they're only breaking even on expenses? Capital considerations is the next thing that really flows to mind, in the sense that, well, will they have to sell the home? What happens if that's not enough? And accommodation considerations. Again, the whole concern of there's so much going on in Tim's mind. Where will his mum live when dad moves into aged care? And what sort of aged care facilities are available for him? To help explain the complexity involved in aged care, we have in front of you a tree diagram. We want to be able to drill down all of these areas throughout the presentation, but just as an overview, I'll take you through some of the key areas that need to be ideally considered in a family situation. Firstly, a family discussion. This could be challenging, this could be threatening for some, to really start to talk about the whole issue of aged care. It's not a happy subject, it's not a subject that people like to think about or talk about, but can you take it from me, it is one of those areas that it is so important to have a discussion. Accommodation options are also there. Now obviously aged care is the key accommodation option that perhaps we might lead to, but before we even get there, there are other options. Other options where people can stay in their family home. And that's the preferable option. That's the option where people can stay well and together, and as a couple can stay in their own home. But there are many other options to consider well before we go down to aged care. But we will drill into each of these areas throughout the presentation. What about cash flow? Cash flow is one of those areas where we know it's going to cost money to be in aged care, and there are many sources potentially of getting the income to pay for fees. So what are those sources? Where does the money come from? Are there ways in which we can even minimise aged care fees? What's the financial strength or wealth of a family? Where can they have capital? What sources of income do they have? Really, the family home is one of those key assets of a family that people have their thinking dominating about. But you can rent a home and you can sell a home, or you can downsize. There are many areas of capital considerations to be thinking of. There might be investments. There could be other sources that we haven't even thought about yet until we start to drill down and think about further. There are legal considerations, And although I won't be going into any great detail in this presentation, as I'm not a lawyer, just to briefly overview these areas, I'll just go into a little bit more detail now. Estate planning is a key area to be thinking of. Certainly when someone moves into aged care, they may not have capacity. And so it is really important to be thinking about all these areas well before someone needs to move into aged care. And because aged care and all that comes with aged care is involved in potentially moving and potentially changing accommodation options, there are always legal agreements associated with those accommodation options. And so because there are legal agreements, it is always very important to get legal advice in terms of what those mean and how they affect you. So what this all means really is that the family has a lot to think about. The family has so many things, so many issues to consider. Let's talk some more about what a family could be discussing when they do get together and they do think about what this means for their mum or their dad, whoever they're thinking about with aged care. Firstly, medical considerations have to be at the top of the list. It's probably because of a medical consideration that mum or dad might need to move into aged care. Having a meeting with the doctor, the family doctor, is a really good idea. There might be health concerns around physical issues, mobility issues, mental, or there might be a progressive disease that has milestones that can be timed and thought through. Preferences with accommodation is also a very important issue. Certain family members might have very strong opinion in terms of where mum or dad should be located, whether the family home in fact should be sold or not sold, what retirement living could or couldn't mean for the individual involved. Keep in mind that that along with all of this is financial considerations, because with every decision around accommodation comes a financial decision. What this actually means for mum and dad's finances. A lot of these things can be very daunting, and having the early discussions can help mum or dad start to get used to some of the issues that come into play here. There are certain parameters where the family just don't want to go to. For example, is selling the home off limits? Is it something that just it will not be considered? And so understanding the parameters, understanding, I guess, the limitations in terms of where the family wants to go is a really important issue. Let's drill into the accommodation options in a little bit more detail. As I said earlier, it's not only Brian's world that is changing, but Helen's is as well. It's really all about choice. Accommodation options are many and varied. And there are many options outside of aged care. So we're going to have a little look at that first before we move on to the aged care options. Firstly, it would be in Brian's best interests, and Helen's as well, to try and keep Brian at home for as long as possible. There are many care packages that the community-based support can provide, and many commercial care packages as well. We mentioned earlier that perhaps Tim might have capacity to either build on a granny flat or have an extra room or area in his home, depending on his family situation, to have perhaps Helen in his house should Brian need to go into care. The retirement village option is again also very varied, and depending on how much money you have really and what your capacity is, you can virtually buy any sort of accommodation you really want. But in a nutshell, you can have all sorts of retirement village accommodation, from being very cost effective to being quite expensive, depending on the level of support that the person in that sort of facility needs. Retirement villages, I guess, can also be very much a lifestyle choice. Helen might not want to be rattling around in the house on her own should Brian go into aged care, and so downsizing as an option might be really what she wants. And of course there's aged care. Let's now look in more detail about aged care itself. In order to move into aged care, to be a resident, an ACAT assessment needs to be done. What is that? That is actually the terminology used. It's called an aged care assessment team has to come in to assess the person. It's a federal government group that checks out and determines whether the individual can actually undergo and undertake activities of daily living. The sorts of things that we're talking about are whether someone can feed themselves, someone can walk on their own without assistance, someone who can go to the toilet by themselves or shower themselves. Fairly basic living requirements, and depending on the degree of that person's capacity will determine whether in fact an assessment is given. Now let's assume in this case that Brian does go into aged care. There are two types of fees that apply. Very broadly, there are fees for the accommodation component, and then there are fees for the ongoing care. Accommodation can be quite expensive, depending on where Brian and Helen decide to put Brian's name down to, but basically it is determined through a calculation depending on their means. We're going to go into a little bit more detail about what that actually means for Brian and Helen as an example, but suffice to say the costs are probably something that most people are worried about and afraid of when they think aged care. There are ongoing care fees as well. They're fees that are associated with giving the actual medical care, the bedside care, as it were, to the resident. There's a standard fee which is calculated at 85% of the age pension, and there might be other fees associated depending on the person's wealth. It's probably fair to say that most people jump to this next one first. Cash flow considerations. How much will it all cost? Now, as I said earlier, there are two types of fees. There's accommodation fees and ongoing fees, and both can have an ongoing aspect to them. Firstly though, before we get into that detail, where's the money going to come from? Depending on the situation of the individuals involved, they might have super, they might have an age pension, and they might have other investment assets that are generating income, or not. There might be other discount entitlements which will have an effect on how much they actually spend, like Commonwealth Healthcare cards or DVA Gold card. The bottom line is, I suppose, whatever those aged care fees become, the goal is trying to reduce them by any means possible, which, as I said earlier, really relies on good planning and planning well in advance. So what does this really mean? I guess it means that thinking these things through really early is important. Closely related to cash flow considerations are capital asset considerations. In other words, if lump sums need to be paid, where on earth are they going to come from? Everyone is now thinking about the family home. The family home is an obvious source of capital. There is no doubt about it. And often people feel that they are forced into having to sell the home. But is that necessarily right? There are many options other than selling the home. And in fact, if you can keep the family home, it works out to be better for the couple. Firstly, one of the options is to rent it out. So if you're looking for cash flow, why not rent out the family home? Of course, we need somewhere for Helen to go to if she's not living there, but that is an option. But if that is an option, is the house in a condition that it can be rented? Does it need to have some works done on it before a real estate agent is ready to put it on his books? You could downsize, of course. It doesn't mean that Helen will be out of house and home. She doesn't necessarily need to be in that house. She could be in a smaller house, which is where perhaps those retirement village options might come into play, but there might be other capital that's released from that sort of transaction. Perhaps there are other investment assets. In this case, you might recall there's a $200,000 term deposit. How do we use that? And maybe, just maybe, there is some money, as we said earlier, that the kids might have available to help mum and dad out. Or, as I've seen previously with clients, where clients have divested themselves of assets through very good planning to the kids well before them passing away, and maybe it's time to perhaps give some of that back. Okay, let's go back to the case study. Let's suppose that Brian does need to move into aged care. Now, the facility they've chosen has an advertised room fee of $440,000. Once Brian does move into aged care, Centrelink will actually treat them as an illness-separated couple. And what that actually means is that they, as a couple, will end up having come into their household another almost $11,000. As I mentioned earlier, Brian has now got new circumstances. He's now moved into aged care. So let's just now consider those two types of fees, the first being accommodation fees. Now, most people who know and have heard anything about aged care would know this as an accommodation bond. Now, under new legislation that came in on the 1st of July this year, 2014, this accommodation bond has changed names, but it's also changed nature. Now, this accommodation fee is based on the client's income and assets. Now, this entry fee can take two forms. It can be a lump sum payment, or it can be a daily payment, or a combination of both. That slide that you're looking at now, there's two bits of jargon, RAD and RAC. Basically, all I want you to remember is whenever you see an R in front of the AD or AC, it's talking about the word refundable. That is a lump sum that is refundable to the person's estate. And the other type of fee is the periodical fee associated with accommodation. And when we see that, again, the jargon is a DAP or a DAC. Don't be too worried by that, but really what the D is referring to is daily. So in other words, there is a daily charge, a daily amount that's payable, and sometimes those daily amounts can be quite sizable. In some facilities, depending on the sort of facility that it is, there can be additional fees called extra service fees, and that too is expressed as a daily amount. As you can see, it can be quite exorbitant. They can range up to, I've seen, $130 per day. The second aspect of aged care fees is the ongoing care fee. Now, there's a part of this that everybody pays. It's called the basic daily fee. That's equivalent to 85% of the full age pension, and currently is $46.50 per day. There is also another aspect, and you may or may not be required to pay this, but it all depends on your means. In other words, what is your wealth? And this is an aspect that we're going to look at next. Now, you might recall that I said that aged care can be complex, and this is where the complexity starts. Now, I'm not wanting to do a whole lot of calculations, but can you take it from me that there's a whole lot of calculations that do need to be done based on a person's income, assessable income, and assessable assets. And depending on the outcome of that calculation will determine whether someone pays a means tested fee or not. there is the government publishes an amount or a threshold that is used to determine whether you are below the line or above the line. And that amount currently is $52.49. So if someone is above that line, if the calculation ends up being more than $52.49 per day, a means tested fee is calculated and a means tested fee is required to be paid. If the calculation determines that it's below $52.49 per day, then no means tested fee is required. Let's bring the means tested fee to life using Brian as an example. Brian's means tested calculation is actually below the line. In other words, the calculation says that he does not have to pay a means tested fee. That really means a lot to Brian, because even though the advertised room fee is $440,000, the calculation determines that a lump sum payable by Brian would be $157,402. Now, the law requires that Brian must have $45,000 left in his name. So he's not allowed to actually pay the full amount, even if he wanted to. The maximum he can pay is $60,000. Now, before you start pulling out your hair and before you start to think this is way too complicated, I just want to explain very briefly that there are actually 3 accommodation payment options that Brian has, and any resident for that matter. He could pay it all as a lump sum. He could pay it all as a periodical payment, or he could pay a combination of both. And there are different financial implications depending on which choice is made. But in Brian's case, because he is only allowed to pay a lump sum of $60,000, he now only has 2 options. So he can pay it all as a periodical payment, which would be $28.85 a day, or he could pay the lump sum of $60,000 and pay an additional $17.85 per day. For any lump sums paid, they are refunded to the estate, a really important issue to remember. For Brian, the ongoing care fee is really very simple. It's only that equivalent amount of age pension. As I said earlier, 85% of the standard full age pension, which at the moment happens to be $46.50. Because he was below the line, there is no means tested fee to be paid. Let's now look at the bottom line impacts of those 2 options. As you can see in this table, the first column actually represents where Brian elects to pay all of his care fees as a periodical payment, and the second option, or the second column along, is where he chooses to pay the maximum lump sum and the remainder as a periodical payment. As you can see, that if he chooses to preserve his capital, he's actually worse off. He is going backwards in terms of cash flow, whereas if he chooses to pay the $60,000 and the smaller periodical payment, he has some surplus. Life is full of changes, and the Wilson house is no exception. So let's fast forward 6 months. Helen has a fall and is no longer independent. She can't remain on her own. Her ACAT assessment approves her for residential aged care, and as it happens, luckily, she is able to move into Brian's facility. As you know, the room advertised fee is $440,000. The only major thing that has changed between when Brian went in and now is that you might recall that Brian took $60,000 out of their $200,000 term deposit, and so they have $140,000 left. The other big change is that their living expenses have reduced dramatically because they don't need to spend as much, and so under this scenario we're looking at probably around $100 per week expenditure. Unlike Brian, Helen is above the line with the means tested fee calculation. And the reason for that is that she's no longer living in the house, and so the house valuation is counted as an asset under that calculation. You might recall that their house is worth $850,000. As I said earlier, the advertised room rate is $440,000, and for anyone above the line, they are required to pay the room rate that is advertised. There are three options. As with Brian, she could pay the full $440,000. She could pay all of that as a daily accommodation payment of $80.65, or a combination of both. But again, like Brian, any lump sum payments that she would make will be refunded to her estate. Helen's ongoing care fees are different as well. As I said earlier, that every resident is required to pay 85% of the full age pension. That's also the case with Helen. But because Helen is above the line, she is required to pay an additional fee. It doesn't seem like a lot, but these things can change. But at the moment, based on the calculation, an extra $2.88 per day is required as a means-tested fee. Now this does have an impact on Brian's fees. Just when you thought that we had it all worked out, because Helen is moving from the family home, it's important to understand that the family home can now be included as part of the calculation of the means tested fee. But don't panic, it's not the whole amount. It's just a concessional amount that the government wants to be added to this calculation, and the figure is there on the slide. It's $154,179. But what this does is that this recalculation of a means tested fee for Brian tips him over to being above the line. And what that actually means is that although they can't ask him to pay the $440,000 for accommodation, they can ask him to pay a higher daily fee. And in his case, his fee needs to increase from $17.85 to $41.49 per day. So the big issue here is, do they sell the home or do they keep the home? Helen could pay the entire accommodation payment as a daily payment of $80.65. The former home actually is in good condition, and she could also rent that property. For the example, we're going to assume that they can get $615 per week. And of course, the other option is to sell that home. So let's have a look at what that actually means. As you can see from this table, there are many options available. And it's interesting that even though we have the same situation, for exactly the same circumstances, there are multiple scenarios that can be applied. Without going into the detail, the main point I'd like to make here is that when you run through all the various financial impacts, depending on what the family wants and depending on what is negotiated with the aged care facility, you can have very different outcomes. Now, you're not expected to know how to calculate these things or how they really work. The real issue is that you need to know someone who can, and you need to know someone who you can talk to about these things. Our advice are here to help Hanrick Curran clients. We're aged care specialists, and we're here to help you should you have any needs in this area. Please talk to your Hanrick Curran advisor if you want to take these discussions any further.